Welcome back, everyone. My name is Dan Vega, and today we are talking about Serverless Spring. So I wrote a new guide for the Tanzu Developer Center called Serverless Spring, which we'll take a look at in a minute. In doing so, I did a bunch of research. I started building some serverless applications in plain old Java. Quickly realized that after you get past the kind of quintessential hello world, that you need a lot of things to start to build real world applications, right? Like you need things like logging and configuration and sometimes dependency injection, how to connect to a database, environment variables. When you do connect to a database, how do you persist and read information from that database? And this is where Spring really obviously helps us out, giving us that framework on which to build our applications. So again, today what we're going to do is take a look at the guide that I put together for this, and we'll go through and build our own service application using Spring, and we'll deploy it to AWS Lambda. The real power behind Spring Cloud Function is that it allows you to build your serverless applications in a consistent programming model, and then deploy those to whatever provider you want. So we're not building specifically a Lambda function, but we are going to deploy it to AWS Lambda. But we could take that same function and deploy it to Azure or Google Cloud or whatever platform you like. So I'm really excited about this one. We're going to go through this guide together and learn how to build a serverless function in Spring. What are we waiting for? Let's write some code. All right, so here's the article on the Tanzu Developer Center. I will obviously leave a link to this article and all of the code that we're going to go through in the description below. But you can walk through this intro. I kind of talk about what Serverless Spring is, what, when, and why. We won't go through it before, but I talk about serverless, kind of the pros to serverless. I think the biggest thing that people kind of like try to figure out as they get into serverless applications are what are the use cases for this? Like, when am I going to reach for this? So I have some examples here of, a full application, a static site plus a backend as a service, a full REST API, authentication. Anytime you want to like transform multimedia, maybe you want to send some email notifications. Maybe you want to transform some data. Maybe you want to run some cron jobs, something that happens on some specific interval. These are not the only ones, but these are really popular use cases for serverless. Then we get into Spring Cloud Function. So this is the project that's going to help us build Spring our serverless applications in Spring. So you can take a look. There's a link to the documentation for Spring Cloud Function. And then we get into the guide. So we're going to get into this. We're going to build this together, but just a couple prerequisites here. The Spring Boot application that we're going to use today uses Java 11. The reason we're using an older version, right now I use 17, 18, 19 for everything. The reason we're using an older version is because when we deploy to AWS Lambda, that is what it currently supports as a runtime. Now, 17 should be supported soon, but at the time of this recording, that's 11. That's why we're using 11. So you want to make sure you have a Java version 11 installed. Again, just a basic understanding of Java, basic understanding of Spring Boot. The final code can be located here at this GitHub link. So to get started, the application that we're going to build today is basically modeled around the idea of starting your own newsletter. Before you can worry about sending out a newsletter, you need to get some subscribers, right? To support this, we need the ability to add a subscriber and a way to find all of the subscribers on our list. So this is a really good use case because this is, in the terms of serverless, because this is, I don't know about you, but I have like 5,000 subscribers on my list. I, at best, get 5 new subscribers a day, and that is at very best. So you can imagine deploying a regular application that's going to be up all day long to handle 5 requests doesn't really make sense. This is where serverless really shines, right? It's going to spin up when it needs to, handle the request, and then go ahead and shut down. So you're only paying for what you are actually using. So to get started, we're going to head over to start.spring.io, and we're going to fill in some metadata about this. We'll call it a newsletter. And so let's go ahead and do that now. So we're going to choose the current stable version, which at the time of this recording is 2.7.5. We are going to choose Maven. We are going to say dev.danvega. We'll call this a newsletter. And then we are going to choose 11. And then we're going to choose 2 dependencies here, just Spring Web and we are going to choose Spring Cloud Function. So that's it. So I'm going to go ahead and generate this project. We're going to download it. I'm going to go ahead and open it up in my favorite IDE, IntelliJ. You can open it up in whatever IDE or text editor you are most comfortable using. So with that, let's head over and write some code. All right, so if you're following along with the article, make sure you read through the section on functional catalog and flexible function signatures. That'll get you kind of introduced to Java 8's function support. And we're going to start here down at the building the newsletter API. So what we're going to do is we're going to build out two functions for our newsletter. One to list all of our subscribers and one to add a new subscriber to the database. You can't see me, but I am doing database in air quotes because to keep it simple, for now, this database is going to be an in-memory collection of subscribers. But this could easily be updated to connect to some kind of relational or NoSQL database on the platform that you're deploying this to. So to get started, we need a class that represents a subscriber in our application. So we're going to start by creating a new package called model. So let's do that here. And we're going to create a new class in here called subscriber. Now we are in Java 11, so I can't reach for my handy records just right now, but that's okay. So we're going to create a new class called subscriber. A subscriber is simply going to have a integer for an ID and a string of type string for email address. And that's it. So we're going to create a constructor that takes both of these in. We are going to create getters and setters for each of these. And then finally at the bottom here, let's just go ahead and create a toString. And we are done with the subscriber model. Next, I want to create a subscriber service that will contain our in-memory collection of subscribers. So I'm going to create a new package. We'll call this service, and I'm going to create a new class in here called subscriber service. We're going to mark this with the @service annotation, so Spring Boot knows to go ahead and manage this for us. So we're going to create a private list of subscribers. We'll call this subscribers, and we're going to init this to a new array list. We're also going to need an atomic integer. We'll call this ID, and we'll say this is new atomic integer, and we'll start this at 0. So the first method that we're going to have is something to return all of the subscribers. So we'll call this find all, and this will simply return the subscribers collection. Next, we need a way to create. So we'll call this create. We'll just take in a simple email address. And to do that, we're going to say subscribers.add, and then we're going to say new subscriber. This takes an ID and an email. So we're going to use the atomic ID integer here, and we're going to say ID add and get, and we'll just add 1 to that, and then we'll pass in the email as well. So that looks pretty good for our subscriber class. Now we can call this from one of our functions to say get a list of subscribers or to create a new subscriber. The next thing I want to do is create a new package called functions, and we're going to add a new class called subscribers there. So you could create individual classes for each function if you wanted to, but because they're going to use the same dependencies or configuration, the dependency being the subscriber service, I find it easier to just bundle them into a single class, but you can go ahead and do whatever you like. So remember, this is going to be a class where you include bean definitions, so we got to make sure we annotate this with @configuration. So let's go ahead and create a new package. We'll call this functions, and inside of functions, we'll create a new class called subscribers, and this is going to be an @configuration class. This class is going to depend on the subscriber service, so we'll need to bring that in. We'll say subscriber service, subscribers, and we'll go ahead and get add a constructor parameter. So we'll get that through constructor injection, and this is where we will need to create our function. So we're going to create a bean here. Let's go ahead and say bean, because again, this is a configuration class. So we need, this is where it comes into kind of the Java 8 function stuff. Like, what do we actually need here? So in this first one, we are going to get a list of subscribers. So how are we going to do that? We're going to use a supplier. So a supplier of what? Of type list subscribers. And now that we have that, we can call this find all. And so let's go ahead and import that class, java.util.function. And what we're going to do is we're going to say that we are going to return the subscribers. So that's our subscriber service dot find all. So that's all this is. So this is a supplier. That supplier is returning a list of subscribers. And the way we do that is we use our subscriber service and we return that. So next, we need a way to take in an email address. We need to consume it. So let's create a new bean. We'll create a function that has a signature of supplier and consumer. Just said that. And so the consumer takes in a type. This is going to be a string, and we'll call this create. So now what we need to do is we are going to return and we are going to get an email address. And what we're going to do with that email address is we're going to call our subscribers.create method and pass in our email address. So as you can see here, this class is fairly simple. Not a lot to it, but it is going to give us everything that we need to both list out and create a new subscriber in our database. All right, so what we want to do now is go ahead and run the application. Once it's up and running, I'm going to hop over to a terminal here and just test this out. So what we could do is we can go ahead and curl this. We can say, I want to go ahead and make a post to localhost 8080/create, and we are going to pass in content type text plain. Now again, you could do this in something like Postman. I'm just doing it here on the command line. And what we're going to pass in is an email address of danvega@gmail.com. We're going to go ahead and hit send, and everything looks okay. Let's go back to here. We don't see anything going on here. So that looks okay. So we can also curl the localhost 8080/find all. And we can see that we get our one email return. Now, this is nice because what is happening underneath the hood is Spring Cloud Function is mapping the name to the name of the bean that we created here. So create, we can go to localhost 8080/create. For find all, for the supplier, we can go ahead and go to localhost 8080/find all. Now we could do something similar in production by passing in a header. And again, this is for me the real power behind this. We have all these different functions. We could create a whole CRUD REST, API right inside this one class if we wanted to. If I was doing this in straight Java, boy, this would be very difficult. I'd have a function for every single endpoint. Before Lambda functions URLs came around, I would have to set up a API gateway route for every single function. It just got very convoluted and a little bit hard to follow. Now with Spring, I get a lot of this out of the box. And again, as we start to build out our real world application, this is where things really come in. So if I wanted to say, get a logger, I can go ahead and say get a logger here. And now if I wanted to, I can say log.info, subscribers.find all was called, right? So now I can get some logging in here without having to, in a normal Java project, you would have to set all of this up yourself. And it's just stuff that I don't want to have to deal with. I want to focus in on my business logic. So now that we've actually built it, we were able to run it locally, which is a really nice feature as well. Now we want to talk about deploying it. So I mentioned this earlier, but one of the benefits of using Spring Cloud Function is that you can write your serverless applications the same way regardless of what platform you're deploying to. This means that you just became a serverless developer for AWS, Google, Microsoft, and a whole lot more by learning what you just did today. So In this project for Spring Cloud Function, there are adapters for AWS Lambda, Azure, Apache OpenWhisk, Oracle Function, and Riff supports Java functions as well. So a whole bunch of platforms are supported right out of the box. So the first thing we want to do is over in our pom.xml, we need to define where we are going to deploy this to. So we're going to add a new dependency here. And this dependency is for Spring Cloud Function. And then you could see these adapters come up. So there's an adapter for AWS, and that's the one that we're going to choose. We're going to refresh Maven to pull in those dependencies. All right, so I'm back here in the article, and the Lambda application has to be a shaded jar. This is the same if you've been following along on this channel with some of the just Java Lambda functions that I've wrote. We use the Maven Shade plugin, but the Spring Boot standalone application does not. So you can use the same app using two separate jars. You could read more about this in the documentation, but ultimately what we are going to need to do is copy this build section over to our pom.xml. All right, so I'm going to override this build section here. And as you can see, we are now we are bringing in the Maven deploy. We have some configuration here to skip true. We have the Spring Boot Maven plugin. So this is using a Spring Boot thin layout. And then we have our Maven Shade plugin. And you can see it has a couple of configuration properties set. So let's go ahead and refresh that. And once that works, we can go right over to the terminal now. So similar how we did this before in just a normal Java project, here we're in a Spring project. All we're going to do is run Maven clean package. And you'll see we have a build success. If we go into the target folder, you'll see we have a couple of jars here. This newsletter jar, so this one we can run standalone. And then we have an AWS jar. And that is the one that we can take and deploy to AWS. So what we're going to do is head over to the AWS console and take a look at how to deploy this. All right, so here I am in Lambda functions. I'm going to go ahead and create a new function. We are going to author this from scratch. I'm going to say this is called YouTube subscribers. Again, we got to pick a runtime here. So I am using Java 11, and we're going to go ahead and choose ARM64, and we're going to go ahead and create this function. Once that's been created, we're going to upload from a zip or a jar. So we know we have that AWS jar. If we go into our newsletter project and into the target folder, we have that -AWS jar. So we're going to go ahead and select that and click save. Next, we're going to go ahead and edit our runtime settings. So here we're going to go ahead and choose a handler. This handler is always going to be the same for Spring Cloud Function. So this is really nice that we just get to go ahead and choose the same handler. Again, this is back in the guide if you want to copy and paste that in. And then we can go ahead and hit save. So now that your environment's ready to go, you'll probably want to test out your function. If you had just a single function, you could test it here in the console. But when you have multiple functions like we do wrapped up in a single jar, you need a way to instruct the platform on which one you are trying to invoke. As I mentioned earlier, this was really hard in the old days. You had to use something like API Gateway, tie it to your Lambda function, and with different roles, like that got a little bit messy. Here, what we can do is go into configuration, and under function URL, we can create a new function URL, which is basically a dedicated HTTP or HTTPS endpoint for our function. When the function URL is configured, you can use it to invoke your function through a browser, curl, Postman, or any other HTTP client. So this is really nice. So what we're going to do is go ahead and create our function URL. I'm not going to have any authentication on this. I'm going to leave this wide open. I am going to configure cores because I may want to hit this, especially the post method. So I want to go ahead and configure cores and allow just everything. I'm leaving this wide open. Again, you should not do this in production, but I just want to, without having to go through and configure all of this. Again, I mentioned this in the article, but this is a good time to mention why we did this. Sure, you can create individual applications for each function, But this becomes really quite tedious. Think about a REST API that talks to a database. For each function you deploy, you would have a lot of shared functionality like configuration, logging, connecting to a database that you'd have to duplicate across projects. With this approach, you package everything up together and then call the individual functions. So what I want to do now is actually open up Postman. And before I do so, I'm going to copy this function URL. This is exactly what we need. So if we go right to the function URL, not only is this going to take a minute to kind of log or to start up, but it's going to error out because we don't have anything to call yet. So I'm going to copy this over to Postman. So this is our function URL. The first thing that we want to go ahead and test is the post. So we want to be able to create a new subscriber in our database. So when we have these multiple functions present in our configuration, we need to tell the function invoker what the target function definition is. And the way that we do that is by providing a header. So if we go over to headers, we can say Spring Cloud function definition, and then the value of that is going to be create. So now what are we passing in the body? We are passing in just a text value for an email address, and I'll use a different one just so we can see that it's different. So I'll say dvega@vmware.com, and if we go ahead and click send now, I am also getting an error. So let's find out what's going on. Let's go over to our logs. And I'm going to click on this log stream. And if we go down here, we should see what is happening. So failed to establish route since neither were provided. Spring Cloud function definition. Did we spell something wrong? Spring Cloud function definition. No, that looks pretty good. Oh, now that I think about it, I don't know why I used underscores here. I would probably just want to go spring.cloud.function.definition. Let's try that. Oh, and there we go. Okay, so being able to look at the logs kind of told me what was going on there, so that is valuable. Again, if they don't always show up right away here under monitor, I always go to CloudWatch, and then this will show you exactly what's going on. So this says okay. So now if I want to go ahead and list all of them, let's go ahead and change this to find all. And there we go. So we are returning all of our email addresses in a collection here. So now looking back at this, I think I made a little bit of a mistake when I was sending the body of this other one. Yep. So let's just change this to danvega@gmail.com. Let's go ahead and say create. And if we send, that is okay. Let's jump back to find all. If I was doing this a lot, I would create two separate requests here, but this is okay. And there we go. There's our two email addresses. All right, congratulations. You just deployed your first serverless application to AWS Lambda. And with the function URL, you can now consume these functions from any clients. So if this is a project you're interested in building out, you could definitely look into something like AWS SES, which stands for Simple Email Service. If you have your email address stored in a database somewhere, it should be fairly simple to send a new email to all of your subscribers. This is one of the many benefits of being on a platform like AWS. There is a service for everything you need. More importantly, we are in the context of a Spring application now. We're using Spring Boot, we're using Spring Cloud Function. So all the things that we need to do when we're building out real applications, we have the ability to do that. So if we want to bring in something like Spring Data JPA, connect to a database, and easily write out a repository that gives us all this CRUD functionality out of the box, we can do so. In prepping for this, I actually created a connection to a database in Java using JDBC, and it kind of took me back, 10 plus years. of writing straight JDBC and SQL, and it was not fun. Like, this can become very cumbersome. So it's nice to have Spring and the wide ecosystem of related projects to go ahead and help us out as we're building these out. So I really hope you enjoyed this introduction to building serverless functions in Spring. If you're interested in learning more about Spring Cloud Function, there's a link for the reference documentation in this guide at the bottom there. In Spring Boot 3, we've introduced ahead of time compilation, AOT, which will allow us to create native executables. This means less memory and faster startup times for our serverless functions. So if that cold start, the first time that it kicks up and has to start up, is becoming an issue, Spring Boot 3 is going to help you out there a lot. So I'm really excited to see what you do with this and see where you run with this. And if you'd like to see me go ahead and create some more tutorials on this, go ahead and leave me a comment below. Speaking of, hey, if you found some value in this, please do me a favor. Give me that thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, and as always, friends, happy coding.